To Keep Him Company by Rosemary Timperley. They came to him only when he was by himself, as when he went into the garden to play or was sent up to bed in his little room. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and 1 girl. He accepted their presence naturally, almost as if they were part of him, yet they did tend to boss him a little sometimes, and when he asked, "Why should I do what you say?" they would reply, "Because we're older than you are." Yet they didn't look any older. "I'm the oldest," the dark boy told him. "He's next," he said, pointing to the fair boy, "and she's next," indicating the girl, "and you're the baby." "But I'm not a baby," Tim protested, with the dignity of 5 years behind him. "You'll always be the baby to us," said the girl, "'cause you're the youngest." But it wasn't often that they argued. Usually he just enjoyed the pleasure of their company. He was an only child, therefore a lonely child, and their presence blurred the edge of that loneliness. When he sat in the sun on the grass in the garden, he liked to see them hovering around, and when he was sent to bed early on summer nights, it was good to have a chat with them before going to sleep. He never mentioned them to his parents. He didn't really know why, but some deep awareness prevented him. When he first went to school, they came with him, for although he could hardly be called alone at school with all the other children around, it was aloneness compared with being at home. He sat at a small desk and was aware of them lingering round him when all the other desks were occupied. Once he said to the teacher, "Can't they sit down?" "Who, Tim?" she asked. "Everyone is sitting down." How queer that she couldn't see them. Perhaps she had bad sight. In the playground, he didn't join in with the other children's games. He stayed with his special 3 friends. The teacher asked him, "Tim, why do you always play by yourself?" "I don't," said Tim. "You funny little boy, of course you do." He almost said, "No, I don't," but refrained. It was wiser not to argue with the teacher, however stupid she was. But as time passed, he did begin to fit in better with his classmates, and when that happened, his 3 would leave him, returning only at bedtime to keep him wistful company. Once he whispered to them, "Don't ever leave me. Don't go away." The girls said, "We're always here when you want us." "But I always want you," Tim protested. "No, you don't," said the dark boy. "You're growing away from us." "Am I getting older than you now?" Tim asked hopefully. The girl laughed. "Silly, you'll always be the baby, even though you do behave sometimes as if we didn't exist." "I'm sorry," murmured Tim, for he knew what they meant. Sometimes the busyness of everyday living took up so much thought and concentration that he did forget about them. It was on the evening of that conversation that he raised his voice when talking with them, and his mother heard him. She came in and switched on the light. "Did you call out, Tim?" "No, Mum. I thought I heard you." She looked round the room. His 3 friends had drawn away from him and stood against the curtains of the window, but she made no comment. "Oh, well, maybe you cried out in a dream," she said. "Maybe," Tim said, keeping his fingers crossed under the bedclothes. "Good night then, darling, my only darling." She kissed him, turned out the light, and departed. "That was a close shave," said Tim. They were still by the curtains in the dark. The girl was crying. "What's the matter?" Tim whispered. "She's forgotten us," sighed the girl. "Cry baby," said the dark boy, and "Soppy," said the fair one. Tim said, How can she forget you when she never knew you?" But they didn't answer, and soon he slept. Secondary school followed primary school, and Tim's life immediately became harder and busier. Sometimes he could barely keep up. The demands were such that time to be himself was almost squeezed out. Turmoil, teachers, traffic, telly, and the torture of piles and piles of homework. The three companions of his childhood rarely visited him now, and he began to think that perhaps they never really existed, that they'd been some sort of babyish imagining. Babyish. When they did come, they still teased him about being the baby. "Baby my foot, I'm 15, he protested to them one sleepless night. "You're the babies now." They laughed and said, "We're still older than you are." He looked at them. They had indeed grown up along with him, but they didn't look older. In fact, they looked rather like reflections of himself in different mirrors. Tim was dark, like the dark boy, but his eyes were blue, as with the fair boy, and he had full lips and a small turned-up nose, like the girl. Next morning he remembered their return, but thought it must have been a dream in which he had only thought he was awake. After all, in dreams one did usually think one was awake. And he had no time to bother about dreams now, with O-levels just around the corner, like a black animal lying in wait. If he made the smallest sign of slacking, his parents began to nag, so imaginary companions were definitely out. Yes, they came to him the night before the O-level exams began. He was tossing and turning, feeling ill with fear, and they were there. "Poor old boy," said the girl. "Sooner you than us," said the dark boy. "We'll keep our fingers crossed," said the fair boy. "It'll take more than that to get me through those bloody exams," Tim moaned. "I could be sick every time I think of it." "We know," they murmured, "we know." They soothed him to sleep. In the morning he thought that dream again, and dismissed it from his mind. Later, however, he brooded about his three companions, and he felt uneasy. He'd read enough by now to know that people who see and hear what others do not see and hear have got something very odd about them. They are having what doctors call hallucinations, as when Macbeth saw Banquo's ghost, and no one else did. He'd been doing Macbeth for his exams, and the teacher had talked about hallucinations and schizophrenia. She had gone on to say that whereas Macbeth had gone mad because of his sense of guilt, some people were thus afflicted through taking drugs, including alcohol. Some were suffering from a diminished supply of blood to the brain, as occurred usually in cases of senility, and some became schizophrenic for no reason at all. Maybe they were born that way. Tim had been frightened by this information, and was glad he had never told anyone about his visitors. He understood the phrase, "cunning of the lunatic," for if he was a lunatic, at least he had the sense to keep quiet about it. He recalled, too, that when his three had come, he had always been glad to see them, so perhaps this very desire to see them had caused their coming. That being so, he must put them right out of his mind, and try to get sane again. He must occupy his life so completely that there would be no room for fantasy. Despite the anxiety, he did very well in his O-levels. His parents were delighted. The headmaster suggested he stay at school for 2 more years to take A-levels, then go on to university. Tim agreed because his parents were so keen, although his heart sank at the thought of all that study ahead. He turned himself into a working machine, cramming facts into his weary head and feeling lonely. Once he even turned on his mother in bitterness and said, "You don't really care about me at all. You and Dad just regard me as something for you to get credit by, a sort of status symbol. Our boy is on his way to university." "What a cruel thing to say," she protested, her eyes full of tears. "It's not true, Timmy. We only want what's best for you. You're all we have." You're all we have. Ridiculous, he thought. They had the house, the car, the telly, each other. He'd been right in what he said, yet he was sorry that he'd almost made his mother cry. He felt ashamed. He wept in bed after the quarrel, and then his three came to him, not speaking, just hovering around in silent sympathy. But he couldn't accept them now. He tried to shut them out of his thoughts, and succeeded. The next day he thought that crazy hallucination again. Visitations from his three became rarer as time went on. Practical living took over. A-levels, university, leaving home to live in digs, intensive study for his degree, a love affair. Lonely people, when they fall in love, do so with a torturing intensity, and so it was with Tim. The girl was a student like himself, but she had all the openness, warmth, and vivacity which he lacked. She was reckless, whereas he was conscientious, extravagant where he was careful, lazy where he was industrious, bold where he was nervous, and sometimes cruel where he was kind. She was surrounded by would-be lovers and could pick and choose her favourites according to her whim. He adored her, and she made him suffer. But she also gave him a motive for living which he'd never had before. She gave him hope on each day's waking, for at least he would see her that day, even if he was out of favour. He still worked hard from a sense of duty to his parents, but some cold part of his mind did that chore. It was no longer important. His heart was possessed by the lovely, uncaring girl. They took their degree exams at the same time. Then came the long vacation, and she went on holiday. 2 months later, she sent him a postcard from Italy, saying that she hoped he was well, and that she had just got married. Something within him died then, but he showed nothing and told no one. He burned the postcard and hardened his heart. Even his exam results, he got a second-class degree, when he feared he might only manage a third, gave him little pleasure, except that he was glad that his parents were glad. He took up teaching. With a second-class arts degree, there wasn't much else he was fitted for, and soon found that he wasn't even fitted for that. Tim's trouble in the classroom was not that he didn't know his stuff and prepare his lessons carefully, but that he couldn't keep the kids in order. He was soft. Sometimes his classes were little less than riots. After one particularly dreadful day, he went back to his digs near the school and felt that he simply couldn't go on. Even the anguish over his love affair had faded, so that his heart was a stone, and the daily torture from the school children made him feel physically, as well as mentally, ill. Escape was necessary, and the only real escape was death. How could he set about dying? He went to his GP and asked for sleeping pills. The doctor wanted to know why he wasn't sleeping and asked all sorts of questions. Tim behaved calmly and sanely, so was given a prescription for 12 pills and told to come back next week to see how he was getting on. He thought 12 might not be enough, so he went to another doctor. This one, frantically overworked, gave him the prescription without the questions. Tim took his hoard back to his room. Up until then, he had thought it would take a lot of courage to kill himself, that he might even funk it at the last minute. But when he had the pills set up before him, with a jug of water and a glass, he found himself unafraid. It would be so wonderful not to have to go to school tomorrow. Fear of life was stronger than fear of death. He filled the glass with water. It was then that they came. They weren't children any more. They were grown up, like him, like different aspects of him, himself in different mirrors. "Don't do it," said the dark young man. "Why not?" said Tim. "It's not right. Such a waste," said the fair young man. "How do you know?" asked Tim. "We know because we're older than you are," said the girl, reminding him of childhood, that foreign country from which he had been exiled so long ago. "But I have nothing to live for," he told her. "You've got life," she said. "Lots of people would be glad of it." like eat your rice pudding and be grateful as children in Africa are starving. Tim sneered, for his self-contempt had driven him to a feeling of contempt for others too. I know I'm mad, he went on, or I wouldn't be seeing you. I don't even know who you are. But we know who you are, they said. Go away and leave me alone. We can only come to you when you're alone, said the girl. Well, you can't any more. I don't want you. They retreated and turned into shadows. Shadow of the wardrobe against the wall, shadow of the bed across the shabby carpet, shadow of the table and chair against the skirting. He hesitated, almost willed them back, stopped himself, held firm to his determination, froze his heart, put handfuls of tablets into his mouth, and washed them down his gullet with glass after glass of water. Then he lay on the bed and waited to die. When he woke, he was in a different room. He'd never seen it before. At first he wondered where he was. Then he remembered what he'd done, and he was horrified. If this was death, he might as well have stayed alive, for he still existed. Was there then no escape at all? Had even the final refuge turned out to be a cheat? His three were standing round the bed where he lay. Right muck-up you made of that, said the dark young man. You silly idiot, said the fair one. We tried to stop you, said the girl. Oh, shut up, he said, trying to close his eyes and ears against them. But he still saw them, against the dark of his closed eyelids, and he heard the girl say, I almost wish he'd made it. It would have been nice for us. Then another voice said, Feeling better? He opened his eyes and found himself staring up at a woman in a nurse's uniform. Am I dead? He asked her. Far from it, she said. Why would you want to be? I was tired of life, and who isn't sometimes? But, thanks to God and the stomach bump, you're going to be okay. Like to sit up? Thank you, he said politely, knowing now that he was back in the prison of life, that his attempt to escape it had failed. It was quite a relief in a way. Better to find him back in prosaic life in an ordinary hospital bed than to think that death was no more than a continuation of that life. That had been a nightmare indeed. The escape hatch was still there. It was just that he hadn't given it a hard enough shove. Maybe those doctors had cheated him by giving him very mild pills. What a rotten trick. But he didn't feel very vigorously about that, or anything else. He felt limp, like an old cabbage leaf. He thought vaguely of the lovely girl, the magnificent butterfly which he had pursued with such a tiny, grotty net. How foolish. He thought of his tormentors in the classroom. They belonged to some past hell. What would happen now? He didn't care. He was tired. A day drifted by like a petal on the wind. His parents, white-faced and tragic-eyed, came to his bedside. Hello, Timmy, said his mother, bending down to kiss him. Hello, Tim, said his father shyly. Sorry, Tim muttered. No, Timmy, said his mother. We're sorry. We didn't realize. You should have told us. There was nothing to tell. But there must have been. Nothing I could tell you. When he said that, they both drew back, as if he were an insect that had stung them, or a gun which had shot them. He didn't know what to say or do. Then suddenly his three came back. They grouped themselves round him and his parents. Don't let them down, said the dark young man, and the fair young man and the girl said almost together, Look after them. Look after them? Them? Did that mean his parents? But they were the ones who were supposed to look after him. And look what a mess they'd made of it. Why should he be expected? Yet, how much older they now looked. Sad and worn. They did look as if they needed looking after. "Don't worry, Mum," Tim said. "I'm feeling fine now. I'll be home soon." "That's what your father and I hoped," she said. "You must come home for a long holiday. Will you?" Tim nodded, and their faces lightened. Then the bell rang for the end of visiting hour, and they went away. But his 3 companions remained, silently haunting the shadows to keep him company. A week later he left hospital and went home to his parents. They were gentle, considerate, unquestioning. He guessed that the hospital doctor had told them to be. Even so, they could have taken it out on him, for all the hurt he'd done them. But they didn't. Weeks passed, and Tim occupied himself by looking after the garden. In the past, with his father at the factory every day, the garden had been his mother's job, but now she had a pain in her back, so was glad for him to do the work for her. He started on it merely because it had given him something to do. Then he found himself enjoying it. He planted, weeded, pruned, mowed, watered. The more he did, the more there was to do. Sometimes, as he worked, he thought of the past, saw that terrible postcard again before his eyes, saw those terrible classes of children again before his eyes, but they were no more to him now than pictures on a screen. Why had he cared so much about pictures? They meant no more to him now than pictures in a magazine or on a television. Remote, nothing to do with him. The garden was to do with him. His hands tending it, his heart going into it. The stone heart was beating again. Roses became his speciality. With their many different names and qualities, he tended to them as if they were his many different children, and often his 3 companions were with him, not doing any work, but drifting around among the shadows in the roses. Sometimes he thought, this is all a dream. It can't go on forever. One day, his mother came to him when he was working in the garden and said, "Timmy, don't you think it's time now to decide what you want to do?" He looked around the small garden, which he had turned into a thing of beauty. "I like doing this, I know," she said, but what?" "Well, your father and I won't live forever. You should be earning." She stood there, white-faced in the sunshine, her hand behind her back where the pain was. "Yes," he'd said, "I better go garden somewhere else for cash." Her cheeks flushed. "Oh, Timmy, that's what we thought. We've been making inquiries. There's a market gardener near here, and your father and I thought," she went on, explaining. So 3 weeks later he was employed by a market gardener whose establishment produced flowers, fruit and vegetables. The work lacked the intimacy and possessiveness one feels about one's own small patch of beauty, but Tim still found that he enjoyed it. Plants and flowers, unlike unloving lovers and tormenting classroom children, needed no commands or demands, only attentiveness, conscientiousness, knowledge, care, and kindness, and Tim could give all those things, especially to the roses, and especially when his 3 companions joined him at work, not doing any, just being there, and he no longer worried about going mad when he saw and heard them. They were just there, and that was that. Years passed. Tim was over 30 now. His employer at the market garden had retired and handed over management to him. At first he'd been scared by the responsibility, but soon found he enjoyed it because he really knew what he was doing and therefore could tell other people what to do with knowledge and without bossiness. His father had retired on a pension now. His mother still had that pain up and down, and he lived with them and looked after them as if they were plants in his garden. He was happy, except for the black fear at the back of every happy person's mind, the knowledge that it can't last, because happiness never does. And of course he was right. One day, when he came home from work, He found his mother waiting alertly for him. "Timmy, quickly," she said. "Yes, what is it?" "I've sent your father down to the shops to get him out of the way. I must tell you." "What?" He chilled through and through. "You know those X-rays I had at the hospital?" "Yes." The chill chilled to freezing. "I haven't got much longer, Timmy. There's nothing anyone can do. I've known it for a long time, really, and now they've told me straight. It's your father who'll feel it the most. So you'll look after him, won't you?" "I will. Of course I will," he promised. And suddenly his 3 companions came and stood by him. His mother, not seeing them, continued. "There's something I ought to tell you, Timmy. Maybe your father and I should have told you before. I realize now that secrecy is bad for anyone, and we may have harmed you by it. Maybe the way we hid things from you must have been at the root of your... "What is it?" asked Tim. "You know we always told you that you were an only child." "Yes." "Well, you weren't, Timmy. There were 4 of you. I had quadruplets, 4 babies. 3 boys and 1 girl. They all died, except for you, the youngest, the baby. So, perhaps, maybe that was why your father and I were always too ambitious for you, driving you on when we shouldn't have done it. It was because the other 3 died, so you were extra precious. So that's why they're here," said Tim. His 3, smiling a little, nodded towards him. "It's all right, Mum," he said. "We'll look after you. The 4 of us. And we'll take care of Dad, too." And his brothers and sister caressed their mother's brow with their shadowy fingers and murmured, "We'll look after you. And we'll take care of Dad, too."